Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales, where the land is as unforgiving as the men who claim to own it, and courage is a rarer commodity than water. Gather round and listen to a story spun from dust and desperation, of a woman pushed to the very edge of her endurance, and the stranger who appeared from the heat haste to answer a cry for a justice this land had long forgotten. The sun was a tyrant. It reigned over the vast, bleached expanse of the Croft dominion with an unblinking, merciless glare, baking the very life from the earth until the ground cracked like old leather. The heat shimmered in viscous waves above the prairie grass, which had long ago surrendered its green for a brittle, uniform shade of pale gold. Dust, fine as powdered bone, was the realm's true currency. It coated everything: thirsty cattle, the weathered fences, the very souls of the men and women who toiled under the oppressive, brassy sky. This was a land of stark, brutal horizons, a place that demanded resilience and rewarded it with nothing more than another day of the same searing struggle. At the heart of this empire of dust and heat stood the ranch house, a two-story monument to stubborn ambition, built from dark, imported timber that seemed to defy the sun's bleaching power. It was a house of straight lines and hard angles, possessing a grandeur that was more intimidating than beautiful. It was a reflection of its owner, Silas Croft. Croft was a man carved from the same harsh landscape he had conquered. He wasn't born to this land, he had taken it, piece by piece, through a combination of ruthless ambition, shrewd business dealings, and a casual brutality that was whispered about in the dusty saloons of the nearby town of Purgatory Creek. He owned the biggest ranch, the deepest wells, and, it was said, the local sheriff. His power was as absolute and unforgiving as the midday sun. And what Silas Croft wanted, he got. Today, he wanted a wife. Specifically, he wanted Alara Vance. Alara stood in the oppressive silence of Croft's study, a room that smelled of aging leather, cigar smoke, and a cloying, masculine pomade. She felt like a trapped bird, a splash of vibrant, defiant life in a room dedicated to the preservation of dead things. The heads of majestic stags and a snarling mountain lion stared down at her from the walls with glassy and seeing eyes. She could feel their silent sympathy. She was young, barely 19, with hair the color of spun corn silk that refused to be tamed by its simple braid, and eyes the startling blue of a high-country lake, a shade of blue that had no place in this sun-scorched world. It was this vibrancy, this untamed quality, that had first drawn Croft's eye. To him, she was not a person, she was a beautiful, wild thing to be possessed, a final, perfect acquisition to adorn his dominion. "It is a generous offer, Alara," Croft said, his voice a low, smooth rumble that did nothing to conceal the steel beneath it. He stood by the large window, a tall, imposing silhouette against the blinding glare of the afternoon. "More than generous. I am offering you my name. I am offering you security. This ranch. This empire." A woman could get lost in a place like this, without a powerful man to protect her. His words were coated in a veneer of civility, but the threat was unmistakable. Since her father had passed a month ago, leaving her alone with a small, struggling homestead and a mountain of debt conveniently held by Silas Croft, this courtship had been relentless. He saw her not as a potential partner, but as a final, troublesome land deed to be signed. Her small farm, the Rocking V, was insignificant in every way but one. It sat upon the headwaters of the Agua Fria, the last free-flowing spring in the entire valley. With it, Croft's control would be absolute. "It is a great honor, Mr. Croft," Alara began, her voice trembling slightly, a weakness she despised. She clasped her hands together to still their shaking. "But my answer remains the same. I cannot marry you." Croft turned from the window, and for the first time, she saw the mask of the charming suitor slip. His face was handsome in a severe way, but his eyes were chips of cold, gray slate. They held no warmth, only a chilling, possessive intensity. "Cannot," he repeated, the word a soft, dangerous hiss. "Or will not?" "I will not," she said, lifting her chin, the blue of her eyes flashing with a spark of the defiance she had inherited from her father. "My farm is not for sale, and neither am I. I will find a way to pay my father's debts, but I will not be your wife." The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Croft's face, which had been tight with irritation, slowly relaxed into a calm, placid expression that was far more terrifying than any overt display of rage. He walked to his large oak desk and picked up a long, leather writing quirt, tapping it idly against the palm of his hand. "A pity," he said softly. "I do so admire a spirited filly. But a spirit, like any wild animal, must be broken. It is a matter of patience, and applying the right kind of pressure." He walked towards her, the soft, rhythmic tap-tap-tap of the quirt against his hand a menacing counterpoint to the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Alara stood her ground, her heart hammering against her ribs, a wild, trapped thing. "You seem to be under the impression that this is a negotiation," Croft continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper as he circled her. "That your will has any bearing on the matter. You are a woman, alone, in my valley. You own nothing. You are nothing, except what I say you are. And I say you will be my wife." "Never," she spat, the word torn from her with a mixture of fear and fury. Croft stopped in front of her. The calm mask was gone, replaced by a sneer of pure, unrestrained malice. "Wrong answer," he whispered. He moved with a speed that belied his size. His hand shot out, grabbing a fistful of her corn-silk hair, and he jerked her head back, forcing a cry of pain from her lips. With his other hand, he backhanded her across the face. The blow was not a slap, it was a bludgeon, a calculated act of violence that sent her staggering, her ears ringing, the coppery taste of blood filling her mouth. She fell to the floor, stunned, her cheek already swelling. Before she could recover, two of Croft's ranch hands, who had been waiting silently in the hall, entered the room. They were large, brutish men, their faces impassive, their eyes empty of pity. They had the dull and questioning obedience of well-trained dogs. "Take her outside," Croft commanded, his voice once again calm, the fury now replaced by a cold, clinical cruelty. "Saddle Blackheart. I believe our dear Alara needs a lesson in the consequences of disobedience. A practical demonstration of what this land does to things that are dragged, kicking and screaming, against their will." Panic, cold and absolute, seized Alara. She scrambled backwards, but the ranch hands were on her in a second. They hauled her to her feet, her struggles useless against their iron grips. They dragged her from the cool darkness of the house and out into the searing, blinding light of the yard. The heat was a physical blow. The yard was a wide, flat expanse of baked, cracked earth, littered with sharp stones and the thorny skeletons of tumbleweeds. Blackheart, Croft's stallion, was a magnificent, terrifying creature, as black as midnight, and possessed of a notoriously volatile temper. He was already saddled, stamping and snorting, his eyes rolling with nervous energy. Alara screamed, a raw, desperate sound of pure terror. "No, please, don't do this." Her pleas were ignored. Croft emerged from the house, calmly pulling on a pair of leather gloves. He watched, an impassive observer, as his men bound her wrists together with a length of thick, rough rope. They then tied the other end of the rope to Blackheart's saddle horn, leaving about 10 feet of slack. "You see, Alara," Croft said, his voice carrying easily in the still, hot air, "everything in this world is about ownership. I own this land. I own those cattle. I own the men who work for me. And I will own you. You will learn to obey. You will learn that your will is a thing of no consequence. You will learn." He took the stallion's reins. "Let her go," he said to his men. They released her arms, and she stumbled, falling to her knees in the dust. The rope between her and the horse grew taut. She looked up at him, her blue eyes wide with a mixture of terror and pleading. "Silas, please." He smiled, a thin, cruel slash in his handsome face. "It's Mr. Croft," he said. Then, he slapped the stallion's flank hard with the flat of his hand. Blackheart, already agitated, exploded into motion. The horse leaped forward, and the rope snapped taut with a force that nearly ripped Alara's arms from their sockets. She was yanked from her feet as if she were a rag doll, her scream swallowed by a mouthful of dust. The nightmare began. She was dragged, face down, across the hard, unforgiving ground. The sharp stones and gravel acted like a rasp, tearing at her simple cotton dress, shredding the fabric in seconds, and then moving onto her skin. Fiery, agonizing pain erupted across her arms, her legs, her stomach. The thorny branches of dead weeds clawed at her, leaving 100 tiny, bleeding cuts. The dust filled her eyes, her nose, her mouth, choking her, blinding her. The horse, now panicked, galloped in a wide, senseless circle around the yard. Ilara was a helpless, tumbling weight at the end of the rope, her body a canvas for the earth's brutal artistry. The world was a dizzying, painful blur of brown dust and blue sky. Her initial screams of terror turned into choked, agonized sobs. There was no thought, no reason, only a universe of pain and suffocating dust. Despair, black and absolute, began to consume her. This was it. This was how she would die. A broken, bleeding thing, dragged through the dirt by a monster's whim. She was about to let go, to surrender to the darkness, when a sound cut through her agony. It was a sound that did not belong. Not the thunder of the horse's hooves, not the cruel laughter of the ranch hands, not her own pathetic sobs. It was the sharp, clean, undeniable crack of a rifle shot. It was followed an instant later by a loud thwack. The stallion screamed, a high-pitched sound of pain and surprise, and reared violently, its forward momentum arrested. The rope went slack. Ilara's tortured journey came to an abrupt, jarring halt. She lay in a heap, a broken, bleeding mess, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. Through the dust and the tears blurring her vision, she saw that the thick rope connecting her to the saddle horn had been severed. Not cut, severed. A single, impossible shot. The world seemed to fall silent. The ranch hands stood frozen, their mouths agape. Silas Croft, his face a mask of stunned disbelief, spun around, his hand instinctively going for the pistol at his hip. And Ilara, lifting her head from the dirt, saw him. He was sitting on a tall, dust-colored horse on a small rise about 100 yards from the ranch house, a place that offered a clear, commanding view of the entire yard. He was a silhouette against the sun, a figure of myth, a lone rider who seemed to have materialized from the heat haze itself. He held a long-barreled rifle, its stock resting against his shoulder, a thin curl of smoke rising from its muzzle in the still air. He was a stranger, an apparition. He was an answer to a prayer she hadn't even had the strength to utter. For a long, suspended moment, no one moved. The stranger on the rise was as still as a statue carved from the rock and dust of the surrounding landscape. He and his horse were a single, unified silhouette against the blinding sun, a silent, potent judgment that had descended upon the Croft dominion's casual cruelty. The only sounds were the panicked snorting of Blackheart, the low, menacing growl that was beginning to form in Silas Croft's throat, and Ilara's own ragged, painful breaths as she lay in the dirt. The stranger was too far away for Ilara to make out his features, but his presence alone was overwhelming. It was in the relaxed, confident way he held the rifle, a natural extension of his arm. It was in the easy, balanced seat he kept on his horse, a sign of a man who had spent more of his life in the saddle than out of it. There was no posturing, no theatricality. There was only a quiet, deadly competence that was more intimidating than any overt threat. He hadn't shouted a warning. He hadn't fired into the air. He had simply acted, his single, perfectly placed bullet a statement of intent more eloquent than any words. Silas Croft was the first to recover from the shock. His disbelief curdled into a black, seething rage. That a common drifter would dare to ride onto his land was an insult. That he would dare to interfere in his business, to damage his property for the severed rope was as much his property as the horse it had been tied to was an act of war. "Who in the hell are you?" Croft roared, his voice booming across the yard, raw with fury. "You have 10 seconds to state your name and your business before my men turn you into a sieve." The stranger did not reply. He simply shifted the rifle slightly, the movement small and economical, but it drew the eye of every man in the yard. It was a silent reminder of the skill he had just demonstrated. A man who could sever a rope at 100 yards with a single shot was not a man to be taken lightly. The two ranch hands, who had started to move forward, instinctively froze, their bravado faltering. "I gave you an order, damn you," Croft screamed, his composure shattering. He drew his own pistol, an ornate, silver-plated Colt, and fired a shot towards the rise. It was an act of pure, impotent rage. The bullet kicked up a puff of dust a good 30 feet wide of the stranger's horse. The stranger's response to being fired upon was unnerving in its stillness. He didn't flinch. He didn't spur his horse. He simply lowered the rifle from his shoulder and rested it across his lap. Then, with a fluid motion that was almost too fast to follow, his right hand blurred towards the pistol holstered on his hip. It was a well-worn, workmanlike weapon, its grip dark with age and use, a stark contrast to Croft's showpiece. There was a second sharp crack, and the silver colt was slapped from Croft's hand, spinning through the air before clattering into the dust. Croft cried out, more in shock than pain, staring at his tingling, empty fingers as if they had betrayed him. The ranch was now utterly, deathly silent. The stranger had not just disarmed the most powerful man in the valley, he had humiliated him. He had demonstrated a level of speed and accuracy that was the stuff of legend, a skill that belonged to gunfighters and lawmen, not common drifters. Slowly, deliberately, the stranger nudged his horse forward, descending from the rise and walking it at a slow, measured pace towards the center of the yard. As he drew closer, his features became clear, and Alara, pushing herself up on her raw, bleeding elbows, got her first proper look at her savior. He was not a young man, but he was not old either. His face was lean and weathered, tanned to the color of saddle leather by years under the sun. A network of fine lines radiated from the corners of his eyes the color of faded denim, which were narrowed against the glare and seemed to see everything at once. A short, neatly trimmed beard and mustache, frosted with gray, covered a square, determined jaw. He wore a simple, dusty duster coat over a plain shirt, and a hat that was battered and sweat-stained, its brim pulled low. There was nothing remarkable about his attire, yet he possessed an aura of quiet authority that was undeniable. He was a man who had seen too much, a man who had stripped his life down to the bare, hard essentials. He stopped his horse about 20 feet from Croft, his gaze sweeping over the terrified stallion, the armed ranch hands, Croft nursing his hand, and finally, Alara. A broken heap of torn cloth and bleeding skin in the dirt. His expression did not change, but Alara saw a flicker of something in his pale blue eyes, a hardening, a flash of cold, controlled anger that was more chilling than Croft's explosive rage. "The lady," the stranger said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone, as dry as the duster on them, "doesn't seem to be enjoying your hospitality." Croft, his face purple with fury, took a step forward. "This is my land. That is my intended. This is a private matter. It does not concern you. Now, you will ride out of here, and you will forget what you saw, or by God, I will have you hunted down and hung from the highest tree in this valley." The stranger's gaze remained fixed on Croft, his expression unreadable. "Seems to me," he said, his voice calm and even, "that a man who treats his intended like that doesn't deserve the land he's standing on. Let the girl go." It wasn't a request. It was a command. "You are in no position to be making demands," Croft spat, gesturing to his two men. "There are 3 of us." "There are," the stranger agreed, his pale eyes flicking for a fraction of a second to the 2 ranch hands. "But you're unarmed. And they," he said, his voice dropping slightly, "don't seem overly keen to die for you today. Am I wrong?" He directed the last 2 words at the ranch hands. The 2 men, who had been holding their rifles uncertainly, looked at each other, then at the stranger's holstered pistol, and then at the ground. Their loyalty to Croft was based on pay and fear, and right now, the stranger was the more immediate and terrifying prospect. They did not lower their weapons, but they did not raise them either. Their hesitation was a clear answer. The stranger's attention returned to Croft. "So, it appears it's just you and me, and you're still unarmed. Now, for the last time, let the girl go." Every word was a heavy, deliberate stone dropped into the tense silence. Croft stared at the stranger, his mind clearly racing, weighing his options. His authority, his power, had been challenged and found wanting in his own front yard. To back down now, in front of his own men, was unthinkable. But to press the fight was suicide. With a snarl of pure frustration, Croft made his choice. He turned on his heel and strode towards the ranch house. "This is not over," he threw over his shoulder, his voice thick with venom. "When you're dying in the dirt, remember this moment. Remember that you chose this." He disappeared inside, slamming the heavy oak door behind him. The spell was broken. The 2 ranch hands, seemingly relieved to have been spared a decision, slowly backed away towards the bunkhouse, their rifles held low. They wanted no more part of this. The stranger waited until they were gone before he finally dismounted. He moved with a slight, almost imperceptible limp, the only chink in his otherwise seamless competence. He walked not towards Alara, but towards the terrified stallion, Blackheart, speaking to it in a low, soothing murmur. The horse, which had been rolling its eyes and stamping, slowly calmed under his steady voice and confident hand. Only when the horse was still did he turn his attention to Alara. He knelt beside her in the dirt, his movements careful, as if approaching a frightened, wounded animal. Alara flinched as he reached for her, a part of her still braced for more pain. "Easy now, miss," he said, his voice softer now, the hard edge gone. "I'm not going to hurt you. The fight's over. For now." His hands were calloused and rough, but his touch was surprisingly gentle as he worked at the tide, cutting knots around her wrists. The rough rope had scraped her skin raw, and the simple act of being freed sent a fresh wave of pain through her. She bit her lip to keep from crying out. "There now," he said, finally freeing her. He looked at the raw, bleeding scrapes that covered her arms, her back, the side of her face where Croft had struck her. His jaw tightened. "Can you stand?" Alara tried, but her legs were a trembling, useless mess, her body a single, unified chorus of agony. She collapsed back into the dust with a soft cry of despair. The fight for her life was over, but the fight for her body was just beginning. She had been saved, but she was still trapped in a broken body, on the land of the man who had broken her. The stranger saw her despair. Without another word, he gently, carefully, scooped her up into his arms. She was light, too light, like a bird with a broken wing. She couldn't stop a small sob from escaping her lips, a sound of pain, relief, and overwhelming gratitude. "It's all right," he murmured, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "You're safe now." He carried her towards his own horse, a tall, sturdy buckskin that had stood through the entire ordeal with an unwavering calm. As he lifted her into the saddle, she looked back at the imposing ranch house, at the dusty yard that had been the scene of her torture. She had been saved from the brink of death, but she knew, with a chilling certainty, that Silas Croft would not let her go. This stranger had intervened, but he had not ended the nightmare. He had only bought her a temporary reprieve. He had rescued her from the immediate danger, but he had also just declared war on the most powerful man in the valley, and he had placed her squarely in the middle of it. Being carried in the stranger's arms was a surreal experience for Alara. One moment, her world had been reduced to nothing but dust and agony. The next, she was enveloped in the scent of sun-baked leather, horse sweat, and the faint, clean smell of sage. He held her with a strength that was both powerful and impersonal, his focus entirely on the practical matter of getting her away from the ranch. She was a fragile, broken package, and he was her solemn, determined courier. He mounted his buckskin behind her, settling into the saddle with an easy, familiar motion. His body was a solid, warm presence at her back, a shield against the world that had just tried to destroy her. "Hold on," he said, his voice a low command near her ear. He took the reins in one hand, his other arm circling her waist to hold her steady. The simple, protective gesture was so foreign, so contrary to the violence she had just endured, that it brought a fresh wave of tears to her eyes. She choked them back, refusing to break down completely. He nudged the horse into a steady, ground-eating trot, leaving the Croft dominion behind them without a backward glance. He didn't head for the main trail that led to Purgatory Creek. He knew that would be the first place Croft would send his men. Instead, he angled the horse towards the broken, rocky badlands to the east, a harsh and forgiving landscape of deep arroyos and sun-blasted mesas. It was a place where a man could disappear, if he knew the way. And the stranger rode with a quiet confidence that suggested he knew it very well. The ride was an exercise in pure misery for Alara. Every jolt of the horse sent waves of fire through her raw, abraded skin. The torn fabric of her dress rubbed against her wounds, and the dust kicked up by the horse's hooves stung her eyes and coated her throat. She gritted her teeth, focusing on the rhythmic creak of the saddle leather and the steady presence of the man behind her. The pain was a sign that she was still alive. She clung to that thought like a prayer. They rode for what felt like hours. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in bruised shades of orange and purple. The stranger seemed to be navigating by some internal compass, following no visible trail, yet moving with an unwavering sense of purpose. He was a man comfortable in the desolate places of the world. Just as Alara felt she could not endure another moment, he reined the horse in. They had arrived at a narrow, almost invisible crack in the face of a tall, rust-colored mesa. It was obscured by a thicket of thorny mesquite and looked like nothing more than a shadow in the rock. "We'll rest here for the night," he said, his voice the first sound to break their long, shared silence. He dismounted, his slight limp more pronounced now after the long ride. He reached up for her, his hands gently spanning her waist. "Easy now." He lifted her down from the saddle, and her legs buckled the moment her feet touched the ground. He caught her, holding her upright until the wave of dizziness passed. He then led her through the narrow fissure in the rock. The inside was a revelation. It was not a deep cave, but a wide, sheltered alcove, like a hollowed-out bowl in the side of the mountain. It was completely hidden from the outside world, and the high rock walls offered protection from the wind. The sandy floor was dry and clean, and in the center, a ring of blackened stones indicated that this was not the first time he, or someone like him, had used this place as a shelter. It was a fugitive's camp, a secret haven for men on the run. The stranger tethered his horse at the back of the alcove, where a patch of tough, dry grass grew near a dark stain on the rock face that indicated a seasonal seep. He unsaddled the buckskin with practiced efficiency, rubbing the animal down with a handful of dried grass. He was a man who cared for his horse as a partner, not merely a tool. While he tended to his mount, Alara sank to the ground, her back against the cool rock wall, every muscle in her body screaming in protest. Now that the adrenaline had faded, the full extent of her injuries made itself known. She felt a deep, bone-bruising ache beneath the fiery surface of her skin. She was a tapestry of pain. The stranger finished with his horse and turned his attention to her. He built a small, smokeless fire in the stone-lined pit, using dry wood he retrieved from a small, hidden cache. The flames cast a warm, flickering glow, pushing back the encroaching chill of the desert night. He then opened one of his saddlebags and took out a metal canteen, a small, battered cooking pot, and a clean strip of cloth. He knelt in front of her, his expression as serious and unreadable as ever. "This is going to sting," he said, his tone a simple statement of fact. He uncorked the canteen and poured some of the water onto the cloth. He then gently, carefully, began to clean the dirt and gravel from the deep scrapes on her arms and the side of her face. Alara hissed in a sharp breath as the water touched her raw flesh, but she did not pull away. She watched his face in the firelight, the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the surprising gentleness of his rough hands. He worked with an impersonal, clinical efficiency, the way a doctor or a veterinarian might. There was no pity in his touch, but there was a profound sense of care, of duty. He was a man who finished what he started, and he had apparently decided that saving her life included patching up the damage. When he was done cleaning the wounds, he produced a small, round tin from his saddlebag. He opened it to reveal a dark, pungent-smelling salve. "Herbal remedy," he explained, seeing her questioning look. "Good for drawing out infection and easing the burn." He applied the cool, soothing salve to her injuries, his touch just as methodical, just as gentle. He then tore her ruined dress to create makeshift bandages, wrapping the worst of the scrapes on her arms and legs. Throughout the entire process, he said little, and Alara found herself too exhausted and overwhelmed to speak. A strange, quiet intimacy developed in the shared silence, the intimacy of a healer and a patient, of two strangers bound together by a single, violent act. When he was finished, he handed her the canteen. "Drink," he said. "You've lost a lot of fluids." She drank deeply, the cool water a balm to her parched throat. He, meanwhile, put a handful of what looked like crushed coffee beans and some dried meat into the pot with some water and set it on the fire to heat. "I don't even know your name," she finally said, her voice a hoarse, scratchy whisper. He looked up from the fire, his pale blue eyes meeting hers. "Name's Jasper," he said. "Most call me Jax." "I'm Alara," she replied. "Alara Vance." He gave a slight nod, as if filing the information away. "Well, Alara Vance, you've had a rough day." It was a staggering understatement, but it was delivered with such simple and adorned sincerity that she felt a lump form in her throat. "You saved my life, Jasper." "Jax," she said, the words feeling inadequate. "Why? You didn't have to get involved. You could have just ridden on by." He stared into the fire, poking at the contents of the pot with a stick. "I've ridden on by before," he said, his voice low, his words seeming to carry a heavy weight of past regrets. Sometimes, you ride on by, and the sound of the screaming follows you. I'm getting too old to be followed by any more ghosts. He offered no further explanation. He simply dished a portion of the hot, thin stew into a tin cup and handed it to her. It was little more than jerky and coffee grounds boiled in water, but to Alara, it was the most welcome meal she had ever had. It was warm and nourishing, and it tasted of life, of survival. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the soft sigh of the wind outside their rocky shelter. Alara looked at the man who had appeared out of nowhere and thrown himself into her fight. He was a mystery, a man of few words and decisive, violent action. He was a man running from his own ghosts. She had been saved from one monster, but she had a feeling she had just thrown in her lot with a man who was haunted by his own. He had rescued her, but he had also made them both fugitives. The night in the hidden alcove was a temporary reprieve, a pause in the storm. She knew that when the sun rose again, the hunt would begin. Alara woke to the smell of strong coffee and the quiet, rhythmic sound of a whetstone on steel. She opened her eyes, and for a disoriented moment, she thought the nightmare had been nothing more than a fever dream. But then, the dull, throbbing ache in her body returned, a brutal reminder of the reality of her situation. She was lying on a soft bedroll, covered by a thick wool blanket that she didn't remember being there before. Jax was sitting by the fire, which had been stoked back to a small, cheerful blaze, sharpening a long-bladed knife with methodical, practiced strokes. The morning light, still soft and gray, filtered into their rocky alcove, promising another hot and forgiving day. She pushed herself into a sitting position, every muscle protesting. Her makeshift bandages were still in place, and the herbal salve had eased the fiery sting of her wounds, leaving them as a deep, pervasive soreness. Jax looked up from his work, his pale eyes assessing her. "Morning," he said, his voice a low rumble. "There's coffee." He gestured with his chin to a tin cup sitting on a rock near the fire. "Thank you," she said, her voice still hoarse. She reached for the cup, her movements stiff. The coffee was black, bitter, and incredibly welcome. It was a taste of normalcy in a world that had been turned upside down. "You slept through the night," Jax observed, returning to his knife sharpening. "That's good. The body does its best healing when the mind is quiet." Alara took a sip of the coffee, the warmth spreading through her. "My mind wasn't quiet," she confessed. "I dreamed of him." She didn't need to say Croft's name. He was a dark, oppressive presence that hung in the air between them. Jax's hand stilled for a moment. "He'll be coming," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "A man like that, his pride is everything. You defied him, and I humiliated him in front of his own men. That's a debt he'll feel the need to pay in blood. He'll have riders out, scouring every inch of this territory." "What are we going to do?" she asked, the question laced with a fear she couldn't hide. She was a farm girl. She knew how to mend fences and birth calves. She knew nothing of being a fugitive. "For now, we rest," Jax replied, his calm demeanor a steadying influence. "You need to regain your strength. This land is hard on the healthy, and it's a graveyard for the weak. We'll stay here today. This place is well hidden. It's unlikely they'll find us, unless they have a skilled tracker." "They do," Alara said, a fresh wave of despair washing over her. "An old Apache man named Chayton. He can track a shadow across bare rock. Croft pays him well to find stray cattle. And sometimes, men who've run out on their debts." Jax absorbed this information with a slight, grim tightening of his jaw. He set his knife and whetstone aside. "That complicates things," he admitted. "But it doesn't change the plan. Not yet. You eat. You rest. We'll move when the sun goes down. We travel faster and leave less of a trail in the dark." He was a man who lived in a world of complicated things, she realized. He was not panicked, just analytical. He was a problem solver, and she was his current, most pressing problem. The day passed in a slow, quiet rhythm. Jax was a man of few wasted movements and even fewer wasted words. He checked his weapons, cleaned his rifle with meticulous care, and mended a tear in one of his saddlebags with a needle and thread he produced from a small leather pouch. He was entirely self-sufficient, a self-contained unit of survival. Alara watched him, 1,000 questions bubbling in her mind. Who was this man? Where did he come from? And where was he going? What ghosts was he running from? He had the skills of a soldier or a lawman, yet he lived the life of a drifter. He was a walking contradiction. She, in turn, focused on her own small tasks. She drank the water he gave her. She ate the jerky he offered. And she rested, allowing the deep, healing power of sleep to knit her battered body back together. In the quiet moments, she thought about her farm, the rocking V. She thought of her father, of his dream to build a life on that small patch of land. Croft's actions weren't just about his desire for her. They were about erasing her father's legacy, about swallowing the last piece of independence in the valley. The thought stoked a small, hard ember of anger in her heart, a feeling that began to burn away the edges of her fear. As the afternoon sun began to slant low, casting long shadows into their shelter, Jax turned to her, his expression serious. "I can take you as far as Silver Creek," he said. "It's a mining town, about today's ride west of here. It's big enough, and rough enough, that a woman on her own can disappear, find work. Croft's reach doesn't extend that far. From there, you could get a stagecoach, head north, start a new life." He was offering her a plan, an escape, an end to his involvement. It was a sensible, practical solution. But the thought of being left alone in a rough mining town, of facing the world with nothing but the torn dress on her back, was terrifying. "And what about you?" she asked, her voice small. "I'll ride on," he said, his gaze becoming distant. "It's what I do." "You're just going to leave?" The question came out with more of an edge than she intended, a hint of accusation. He looked at her, and she saw a flicker of something in his pale eyes, a deep, ancient weariness. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "I'm not the kind of man you want to tie your future to. I don't bring peace. I bring trouble. The best thing I can do for you is get you to a safe place and then disappear from your life. Believe me." There was a finality in his tone that silenced her. He was a man with a code, and his code apparently dictated that he remain alone. He was a ghost, and ghosts don't put down roots. As night fell, they prepared to leave. Jax saddled his horse and helped her into the saddle. Riding was still painful, but it was a dull, bearable ache now, not the blinding agony of the previous day. They traveled under the light of a sliver of moon, the landscape transformed into a ghostly world of silver and black. Jax navigated the treacherous terrain with an unerring confidence, his horse picking its way through the rocks as if it could see in the dark. They moved in silence, to small, solitary figures in the vast, indifferent wilderness. They had been riding for several hours when Jax suddenly reined in his horse, holding up a hand for silence. He sat perfectly still in the saddle, his head cocked, listening. Ilara held her breath, straining to hear what he had heard. At first, there was nothing but the chirping of the crickets and the whisper of the wind through a lone, skeletal juniper tree. Then she heard it. A faint, distant sound, almost lost in the vastness of the night. The sound of a shod hoof striking rock. It was followed by another, and then another. It was the sound of multiple riders, moving carefully, but not carefully enough. Jax dismounted in a single, fluid motion. "Get down," he whispered, his voice urgent, "and keep quiet." He pulled her from the saddle and led her and the horse behind a large jumble of boulders that offered deep shadow and cover. He drew his rifle from its saddle scabbard, his movements economical and deadly serious. "They found our trail," he breathed, his eyes scanning the moonlit ridge from which the sounds were coming. "That tracker, Chayton, he's even better than you said. They must have been pushing hard to catch up to us this fast." Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. They were cornered. The brief illusion of safety was shattered. The hunt was not just beginning, it was upon them. The riders drew closer. Alara could see their silhouettes now, dark shapes moving against the star-dusted sky. There were at least 5 of them. They were moving slowly, methodically, following the trail. Chayton, the Apache tracker, would be at their head, his eyes reading the story of their passage in the displaced stones and bruised sage. Jax rested the barrel of his rifle on a flat-topped boulder, taking aim. Ilara watched him, her breath caught in her throat. He was calm, his breathing steady, his focus absolute. He was a predator in his element. "When I fire," he whispered, without taking his eyes from the sights, "it's going to get loud. Stay down, and stay behind this rock. Don't move, no matter what happens. Understand?" She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. The echoes of his past, the ghosts he had spoken of, were about to become very real and very violent. The quiet canyon was about to become a war zone. The moments stretched into an eternity. Alara huddled behind the cold, solid reality of the boulder. Her world shrunk to the space of a few square feet. She could hear the blood pounding in her ears, a frantic drumbeat against the vast, waiting silence of the night. Beside her, Jax was a study in absolute stillness, a part of the rock and shadow, his rifle aimed at the approaching riders. He was not waiting for them to get closer. He was choosing his moment, controlling the terms of the engagement. The lead rider, a small, lean man who sat on his horse with a natural, easy grace, was undoubtedly Chayton. He paused, holding up a hand to halt the men behind him. Even in the pale moonlight, Alara could see him dismount and kneel, examining the ground. He had found something to fresh track, a sign that their quarry was very near. He pointed towards their hiding place. That was the moment Jax chose. He didn't aim for Chayton. A good tracker was too valuable to Croft to risk killing. He aimed for the man just behind him, a large, bulky silhouette who was craning his neck to see what the tracker had found. The rifle shot was a deafening, violent explosion that ripped the night apart. It was not a warning. It was a judgment. The bulky rider was slammed from his saddle as if struck by a giant, invisible fist, a choked cry escaping his lips before he hit the ground with a heavy, final thud. For a split second, there was chaos. The riders' horses shied and reared at the sudden, shocking violence. The men, startled, yelled in confusion and surprise. Then, their training, or perhaps just their instinct for survival, took over. They dove from their saddles, seeking the scant cover offered by the rocks and scrub brush on the ridge. "He's over there, in the rocks," one of them shouted, his voice tight with panic. The response was a volley of gunfire, the muzzle flashes bright, angry blossoms in the darkness. Bullets whined through the air, ricocheting off the boulders around Alara and Jax with sharp, terrifying pings. Splinters of rock stung Alara's cheek, and she pressed herself flatter against the ground, a whimper of fear escaping her lips. Jax was already moving. He didn't stay in one place, a static target. He fired once more from his initial position, forcing the riders to keep their heads down, and then, under the cover of their own return fire, he melted back into the deeper shadows, moving with a silent, limping grace. Alara, her heart in her throat, watched him disappear. For a terrifying moment, she was alone. But then, the rifle cracked again, this time from a new position, 30 yards to the left. Another of Croft's men cried out, a sharp, angry curse, and began firing wildly at the new muzzle flash. Jax was playing a deadly game of cat and mouse, using the darkness and the terrain as his allies. He was a ghost, a phantom sniper, never in the same place twice, his single rifle sounding like a small army. The gunfight settled into a tense, deadly rhythm. The riders would fire at Jax's last known position, their shots illuminating the landscape in brief, strobing flashes. Then, from a different shadow, at different angle, Jax's rifle would answer, his single, carefully aimed shots infinitely more terrifying than their panicked volleys. He was dismantling them, piece by piece, sowing confusion and fear. Alara, huddled behind the rock, began to understand. This was not a fight Jax intended to win through brute force. He was waging a psychological war. He was turning their greatest asset, their numbers, against them. In the dark, in this confusing, rocky terrain, they couldn't be sure if they were fighting one man or five. Every shadow held a potential threat. The vast, empty wilderness had become their enemy. Time lost all meaning. The gunfight could have lasted for 10 minutes or an hour. Alara's fear, which had been a sharp, paralyzing thing, slowly began to transform. She was still terrified, but new, cold resolve was creeping in. She was not a helpless victim anymore. She was a participant, a witness, and she was a survivor. This man was fighting, and possibly dying, for her. The least she could do was not cower in a blind panic. She began to watch, to listen. She forced herself to breathe, to think. She could hear the riders shouting to each other, their voices strained. "Did you see him? He's over by the dead juniper. No, he's on the right." They were disorganized, frightened. They were losing. Then, the dynamic of the fight changed. The firing from the ridge began to concentrate, to become more organized. She heard a new voice, a calm, authoritative voice, cutting through the panic. "Hold your fire. Hold your damn fire. You're wasting lead. Jed, circle around to the left. Billy, stay with me. We'll pin him down. Chayton, find him." A new man had taken command, someone with a cooler head. The random, panicked shooting stopped, replaced by a tense, waiting silence. Alara's blood ran cold. This was more dangerous. This was a calculated hunt. She could hear the scrape of boots on rock as one of the men Jed began to move, trying to flank Jax's position. Jax must have heard it too. His rifle cracked once, from a position much closer than before. A man screamed, a long, drawn-out sound of pure agony. It wasn't a death cry. It was the sound of a man who was gravely wounded. "He got Jed? The bastard shot Jed," the one called Billy yelled. The cool-headed commander's voice cut through the air again, tight with fury. "I said, hold your fire. Don't give away your position." But it was too late. Billy, enraged and frightened by his friend's screams, opened up with his pistol, firing blindly into the darkness where he thought Jax was. The muzzle flashes gave away his position perfectly. Jax's rifle answered instantly. A single shot. Billy's firing stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the whimpering of the wounded Jed. Now there was only one shooter left on the ridge, the commander. And the tracker, Chayton, who was a hunter, not a gunman. The commander was smart. He didn't fire. He didn't make a sound. The silence stretched, a battle of nerves. Who would move first? Who would make the fatal mistake? Alara held her breath. She scanned the ridge, her eyes now accustomed to the dark. She saw a flicker of movement, a shadow detaching itself from another shadow. It was Chayton. He was moving, not towards Jax, but away, slipping back the way they had come. He was abandoning the fight. He was a tracker, paid to find, not to die. Now it was just one-on-one. Jax versus the last rider. Suddenly, from behind her, from the direction of their hiding place, a voice snarled out of the darkness. "Drop the rifle, cowboy, or the girl gets it." Alara's heart stopped. The commander hadn't stayed on the ridge. While Chayton had made his show of retreating, the commander had used the distraction to circle all the way around, coming up on them from behind. He was standing not 10 feet from her, a stocky, dark-bearded man, his pistol leveled not at Jax, but directly at her head. Jax, who had been focused on the ridge, slowly rose from his crouched position, his rifle held loosely in his hands. He turned, and in the pale moonlight, Alara could see his face. His expression was grim, his pale eyes like chips of ice. He had been outmaneuvered. The hunter had become the trapped. The battle of shadows was over, and they had lost. The stocky, bearded man, whose name was Cole, grinned, a flash of white teeth in the darkness. He was a veteran of a dozen such brutal skirmishes, and he knew a winning hand when he held one. The girl was lace up his sleeve. "I knew you wouldn't leave your little stray behind," Cole sneered, his pistol held rock steady on Alara. "That's the trouble with men who try to be heroes. Always got a weakness. Now, I'll say it again. Drop the rifle. Kick it over here. Nice and slow." Alara's mind was a maelstrom of terror. She was the reason he was caught. Her presence, her weakness, was going to get him killed. Guilt, sharp and suffocating, mingled with her fear. She looked at Jax, her eyes pleading, though for what, she didn't know. Jax's gaze was fixed on Cole, his expression unreadable. He had faced down armed men before. He had been in situations just as desperate. But he had always been alone. The equation had always been simple, his life against theirs. Now, there was a new variable, an innocent life that he had dragged into his world. The weight of that responsibility was heavier than any gun. Slowly, deliberately, Jax lowered the rifle, its butt scraping softly on the rock. "All right," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble, betraying none of the tension that must have been churning inside him. "No need for anyone else to get hurt. The girl has nothing to do with this." "She has everything to do with this," Cole countered, his grin widening. "She's the reason, mister. Croft is paying us a handsome bonus for your hide, hero. Now, the rifle. Kick it." With a reluctant slowness, Jax nudged the rifle with the toe of his boot, sending it sliding across the dusty ground until it came to rest near Cole's feet. He then slowly raised his hands to shoulder height, a clear gesture of surrender. "And the pistol," Cole commanded, his confidence growing. Left hand. To fingers. Take it out and drop it. Jax complied, his movements still measured and calm. He drew his Colt with his left hand and let it fall to the dirt. He was now completely disarmed. A wave of despair washed over Alara. It was over. Smart man, Cole said with a chuckle. He kept his gun on Alara but stooped slightly to pick up Jax's rifle. It was a small, almost insignificant shift in his attention, but in the deadly calculus of a standoff, it was a universe of opportunity. In that split second, as Cole's eyes flickered downwards, Jax moved. It was not the explosive speed of his draw. It was a different kind of movement, a desperate, explosive lunge. He didn't go for Cole. He went for Alara. He launched himself sideways, tackling her, wrapping his body around hers as he drove them both to the ground behind the largest of the boulders. The world became a blur of motion and a deafening roar. Cole, startled by the sudden move, fired his pistol, the shot going wild, the bullet screaming off the rock just above their heads. At the same time, from his prone position on the ground, Jax's right hand, which had been empty and raised in surrender, now held a second, smaller Guna 2-shot Derringer that he had produced from a hidden holster inside his boot. He fired from the ground, the small gun making a sharp, flat crack that was almost lost in the echo of Cole's own shot. It was an impossible shot, made from an awkward, defensive position. But it found its mark. Cole grunted, a sound of pained surprise. He staggered back a step, his pistol wavering. The small caliber bullet hadn't been a killing shot, but it had struck him in the thigh, a painful, disabling wound. He roared in anger and pain, and brought his pistol back up, ready to fire again. He never got the chance. From the moment Jax had tackled her, Alara's mind had been working with a strange, preternatural clarity born of pure adrenaline. She was no longer a victim. She was a survivor. As they hit the ground, her hand had landed on something hard and round, a rock, about the size of a man's fist. Without thinking, without hesitating, she grabbed it. While Cole was focused on Jax, Alara scrambled out from under him. She rose to her knees, a wild, fierce spirit in her eyes, and with a desperate scream that was part terror and part rage, she threw the rock with all her might. The rock, thrown from a distance of less than 10 feet, struck Cole squarely in the side of the head. His eyes went wide with shock, and his pistol discharged into the night sky as he crumpled to the ground, unconscious. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the sound of their own ragged, gasping breaths. It was over, for real this time. Alara knelt in the dust, her body trembling, the rock still clutched in her hand. She stared at the unconscious form of Cole, then at her own hand, as if it belonged to someone else. She had done that. She had fought back. Jax pushed himself up, wincing as he put weight on his bad leg. He looked at Cole, then at Alara. A slow, faint smile touched the corners of his lips, a rare expression of genuine approval. "You've got a good arm, Alara Vance," he said, his voice soft. He retrieved his weapons, quickly reloading his Colt. He checked on the man named Jed, who was still alive, though badly wounded. "We need to get out of here," Jax said, his voice once again all business. "His friends will be back. Or Croft will send more. This valley is a hornet's nest now." He worked quickly, stripping Cole and the other dead man of any useful supplies, ammunition, a water skin, a small pouch of food. He was a pragmatist, a survivor. He then turned his attention to their horses, which had scattered during the fight. He let out a low, soft whistle, and his own buckskin trotted calmly out of the shadows. The other horses were more skittish, but he managed to catch Cole's mount, a sturdy-looking bay. "You'll ride this one," he said to Alara, handing her the reins. "It'll be easier than riding double." She took the reins, her hands still shaking slightly. She had crossed the line tonight. The farm girl who had been dragged through the dirt just a day ago was gone, replaced by someone she didn't yet recognize. Someone who could fight, who could hurt, who could survive. They mounted up, leaving the dead and wounded behind them under the cold, indifferent light of the moon. They rode not west, towards the relative safety of Silver Creek, but east, deeper into the desolate and map Badlands. "Where are we going?" Alara asked, her voice stronger now, clearer. "Somewhere he won't think to look," Jax replied, his gaze fixed on the dark, jagged horizon. "A place where we can rest, heal, and make a real plan. Croft thinks he's hunting a lone wolf and a lost lamb. It's time we started hunting back. His words sent a shiver through her, but it was not a shiver of fear. It was a thrill of something new, something dangerous and empowering. She was no longer just being rescued. She was a partner in a desperate gamble. And as she rode beside the quiet, deadly man who had saved her, deeper into the lawless heart of the Wild West, she felt, for the first time in her life, a sense of terrifying, exhilarating freedom. They rode east for the rest of the night, pushing their horses through a landscape that grew progressively more hostile. The rolling, rocky hills gave way to a maze of steep-walled canyons and knife-edged ridges, a fractured, broken land that looked as if some angry god had tried to shatter it with a giant hammer. This was the Devil's Anvil, a stretch of badlands so notoriously difficult to traverse that even the Apache generally avoided it. Jax, however, navigated it with a quiet, unerring confidence. He seemed to know every hidden pass, every game trail, every natural rock formation that could hide them from a pursuing posse. He was a man who had made a study of the forgotten and forsaken places of the world, and Alara realized that his limp was not just a weakness, it was a roadmap of a hard-lived life. A testament to the countless times he had been forced to rely on his wits and his knowledge of the land to survive. As the first, pale fingers of dawn began to probe the eastern sky, they arrived at their destination. It was a place that did not appear on any map, a hidden box canyon accessible only through a narrow, winding passage that was almost completely concealed by a massive rockfall. Inside, it was a hidden paradise, a startling pocket of life in the midst of the desolation. A small, clear spring trickled from the canyon wall, feeding a grove of hardy cottonwood trees and a patch of lush, green grass. It was a place of impossible, secret beauty. "We'll be safe here for a few days," Jax said, his voice rough with exhaustion as he dismounted. "No one comes here. They say it's haunted by the ghosts of prospectors who died looking for a lost Spanish silver mine." He looked around the tranquil canyon. "I've always found ghosts to be better company than most men." Alara slid from her saddle, her body a single, unified ache. She had been running on pure adrenaline for 2 days, and now, in the relative safety of this hidden sanctuary, the exhaustion hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her legs trembled, and she had to lean against her horse for support. Jax saw her weariness. "Get some rest," he said, his tone softer than she was used to. "I'll take the first watch." She didn't need to be told twice. She found a spot of soft grass under one of the cottonwoods, and using her saddle as a pillow, she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, the first true rest she had known since her nightmare had begun. She awoke in the late afternoon to the smell of roasting meat. Jax was tending a small, smokeless fire, a rabbit spitted on a green stick over the flames. He had been busy while she slept. He had picketed the horses in the best grass, refilled their water skins, and had even used a piece of discarded cloth to further bandage her wounded hands. He was a man incapable of true stillness, always preparing, always working. "Feeling better?" he asked, not looking up from his task. "Yes," she said, and was surprised to find that it was true. The sleep had worked a miracle. Her body still ached, but the sharp edges of the pain had been smoothed away. More importantly, her mind felt clear, her fear replaced by a cool, lucid determination. "Thank you," he just grunted in response, but she was beginning to learn how to read his silences. His grunt was one of acknowledgement, of a shared understanding that needed no flowery words. They ate the rabbit in a comfortable silence, watching as the sun began to set, painting the high canyon walls in spectacular hues of red and gold. The beauty of the place was a stark, poignant contrast to the ugliness they had fled. "What you did back there," Jax said suddenly, his voice quiet as he stared into the fire, "with the rock. That took courage." Alara looked down at her hands. "I was just angry," she confessed. "Angry at him, at them. Angry at being helpless." "Anger is a tool," Jax replied, his pale eyes meeting hers. "It can get you killed if you let it run wild. But if you temper it, if you give it a purpose, it can keep you alive when everything else has failed. You've got a fire in you, Alara Vance." Croft tried to stamp it out, and all he did was stir the embers. His words were a strange, powerful kind of praise. He wasn't comforting her. He was acknowledging her strength, seeing her not as a victim he had rescued, but as a fellow survivor, a partner. "You said You said we should start hunting back, she said, her voice a little unsteady as she voiced the dangerous idea. What did you mean? Jax tossed the rabbit bone into the fire and leaned back against his saddle. A man like Croft, he began, his voice taking on a low, lecturing tone. His power isn't just in his guns or his money. It's in his reputation. He rules through fear. People in Purgatory Creek, the other ranchers, they do what he says because they're afraid of what will happen if they don't. Right now, he's lost a dozen men. He's been beaten twice. His reputation is wounded. If we just run, he'll eventually recover. He'll create a story that he drove us off. His power will be restored. He paused, letting his words sink in. But if we hit him, if we take the fight to him, we can shatter that illusion of power. We can show people that he's not a god. He's just a man. And a man can bleed. How? Alara asked, her mind racing. There are only two of us. He has dozens of men, an entire ranch. We don't fight his army, Jax explained, a hard, strategic glint in his eyes. We fight his business. We become ghosts. We raid his supply lines. We run off his cattle. We make him look weak, incompetent. We bleed him dry, financially and in reputation. We turn his own valley against him. It was a bold, terrifying plan. It was the plan of a guerrilla fighter, a revolutionary. It was a plan that would almost certainly get them both killed. But as she listened, Alara felt that ember of anger inside her glow a little brighter. The idea of fighting back, of not just surviving but of taking a piece of Silas Croft for every wound he had inflicted on her, was a powerful, seductive thought. Why, she asked, the question changing from how to the one that truly mattered. Why would you do this? This isn't your fight. You could be halfway to California by now. Why risk your life for me, for a piece of land that means nothing to you? Jax was silent for a long time, his gaze lost in the deepening twilight. The ghosts he had spoken of seemed to gather around him in the shadows. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with the weight of a past he had never been able to outrun. Because I had a wife once, he said, the words so soft she had to strain to hear them. And a daughter. We had a small farm, just outside of Abilene. It wasn't much, but it was ours. There was a land baron there. A man like Croft. His name was Barrett. He wanted our water. He tried to intimidate us, to buy us out. I was young and proud. I told him to go to hell. He took a deep, shuddering breath. I was away, selling some cattle. Barrett and his men. They didn't wait. They came to the farm. They burned it to the ground. My wife, my little girl. They were inside. The confession, stark and terrible, hung in the air between them. Alara felt a profound, aching sorrow for him, a pain so deep it was almost a physical thing. All of his hardness, his solitude, his weary competent seat all made a terrible kind of sense now. I hunted Barrett and his men, Jax continued, his voice a dead, flat monotone. I hunted them for a year. I found every last one of them. And when I was done, there was nothing left. The farm was gone. My family was gone. I was just a man with a gun and a list of ghosts. I've been writing ever since. He finally looked at her, and his pale eyes were filled with a raw, naked pain that stole her breath. When I saw what Croft was doing to you, it was like seeing it all over again. Another bully, another piece of land, another innocent person about to be crushed under the heel of a rich man's boot. I told myself I rode on by before. That was the lie I told myself about my own family. I wasn't there. I rode on by. I can't do it again, Alara. I won't. This time the story is going to have a different ending. Now she understood. This was not just her fight. It was his too. It was his chance at redemption, his opportunity to fight the battle he had been too late for all those years ago. She was no longer just a girl he had rescued. She was the embodiment of a second chance. All right, she said, her voice quiet but firm, filled with a resolve that was as strong and unyielding as his. Where do we start? The decision to fight back transformed the atmosphere in the hidden canyon. The quiet sanctuary became a war room. They were charged with a tense, focused energy. Alara's role shifted from that of a recovering victim to an active participant, and she found a strength and resourcefulness within herself that she never knew she possessed. She was no longer just a farmer's daughter, she was the last surviving heir of the Rocking V, and she was fighting for her birthright. Her knowledge became their greatest asset. While Jax was the master of tactics and combat, she was the master of the local terrain and its people. She drew a crude but detailed map in the sand, marking the location of Croft's line shacks, the best grazing pastures, the weakest points in his fence lines, and, most importantly, the routes his supply wagons took from Purgatory Creek. Every 2 weeks, she explained, pointing a stick at a winding trail on her sand map, Croft gets a wagon load of provisions. Whiskey, flour, ammunition. Everything his men need. It's usually only guarded by 2 men, an old-timer named Pop and a young kid called Billy. They're not fighters. A plan began to form, a Ghost's first strike designed not to kill, but to cripple and confuse. They would hit the supply wagon. For 3 days, they prepared. Jax taught Alara the basics of using a rifle, not just how to shoot, but how to load, clean, and care for the weapon. He was a patient, methodical teacher, and she was a quick, determined student. He saw that her anger, when focused, gave her a steady hand and a clear eye. She would never be a natural gunfighter like him, but she could be a competent defender. They also made other preparations. Using her knowledge of the local flora, Alara gathered a specific type of thorny vine, its spines long and needle-sharp. They spent an afternoon weaving these vines into thick, wicked-looking bundles. Jax, watching her work with a grim approval, called them the Devil's Nests. On the 4th day, they left the safety of their canyon. They rode under the cover of darkness, arriving at a narrow pass on the wagon trail hours before dawn. This was the spot Alara had chosen, a place where the trail was hemmed in by steep, rocky walls on both sides, leaving no room for the wagon to turn around. They set their trap. They laid the thorny devil's nests across the trail, concealing them with a light layer of dust. They then took up positions on the rocky slopes above the pass, Jax with his rifle on one side, Alara with the second rifle taken from Croft's men on the other. They were perfectly concealed, with a clear line of sight to the trail below. They waited. The sun rose, and the heat began to build. The silence of the pass was absolute. Alara's heart pounded with a mixture of fear and anticipation. This was it. There was no turning back. Around mid-morning, they heard it, the rumble of wagon wheels and the jingle of harness. A few minutes later, the supply wagon lumbered into view, pulled by 2 sturdy mules, with Pop at the reins and young Billy sitting beside him, his rifle across his lap. The wagon rolled directly into the pass. The mules, sensing something wrong, hesitated, but Pop urged them on with a flick of the reins. The front wheels hit the concealed bundles of thorns. There was a loud pop as the first terreno, not a tire, the mules' hooves. The mules screamed in agony as the sharp thorns pierced their sensitive frogs. The animals reared and bucked, throwing the wagon into chaos. Pop and Billy were thrown from their seats, landing in a heap on the dusty trail. Before they could recover, Jax's voice boomed from the rocks above, amplified by the narrow canyon walls. "Drop your weapons. You are covered from both sides. Do not attempt to resist." Pop, a grizzled old man with more sense than courage, immediately threw his hands in the air. Young Billy, however, scrambled for his rifle. A single shot cracked from Jax's position. It didn't hit Billy. It struck the rock an inch from his hand, sending a spray of stone chips into his face. He yelped and scrambled back, his hands raised high. Jax and Alara emerged from their hiding places, their rifles leveled. Jax, his face partially covered by a bandana, moved down the slope with his characteristic limping grace. Alara remained in her position, her rifle providing cover, her presence on the opposite slope confirming the threat that they were surrounded. To Pop and Billy, it looked as if they were caught in a perfectly executed ambush by a much larger force. Jax disarmed the 2 men efficiently, tying their hands with a length of rope from the wagon. He was firm, but not cruel. "We have no quarrel with you," he said, his voice a low growl. "Our business is with your boss. You will not be harmed if you follow our instructions." They worked quickly. Alara, her own face now covered with a bandana, came down from the slope and stood guard over the prisoners while Jax systematically disabled the wagon, breaking a wheel and cutting the harness. He then went through the supplies, taking only what they could carry: several boxes of ammunition, a sack of flour, coffee, and 2 repeating rifles that were part of the cargo. He left the whiskey and the personal belongings of the men untouched. This was not a robbery for profit, it was a strategic strike. Finally, he led the two prisoners and the now lame mules a short distance up the trail, leaving them tied to a tree where they would be found eventually. "Tell Silas Croft," Jack said to the terrified men, his voice a cold, final warning, "that the ghosts of the Rocking V have come to collect his debt. Tell him this is just the beginning." He and Alara mounted up and melted back into the Badlands, disappearing as quickly as they had come. They had done it. Their first strike was a success. They had crippled Croft's supply line, armed themselves, and, most importantly, they had sent a message. They were not just running. They were not just hiding. They were fighting back. They were the ghosts, and their war had just begun. News of the wagon raid spread through Purgatory Creek like a prairie fire. The story, as told by a shaken Pop and an indignant Billy, grew with each retelling. It wasn't just two people, they claimed, but a half-dozen shadowy figures, perfectly positioned, who moved with the silence of ghosts. They spoke of a man with eyes like ice and a voice like thunder, and a woman, a vengeful spirit, who stood with him. The raiders hadn't been common bandits. They took ammunition and food, but left the whiskey. They weren't thieves, they were warriors. And they had left a message: the ghosts of the Rocking V have come to collect. The effect on the valley was immediate and profound. For years, Silas Croft had ruled through an iron-fisted reputation of invincibility. Now, that reputation had a crack in it. He had been challenged not by a rival baron, but by the very people he had tried to crush. The whispers in the saloons and general stores changed. Fear was still the dominant emotion, but it was now mingled with a new, dangerous ingredient: hope. Someone was finally fighting back. For Croft, the raid was a public humiliation. He flew into a rage, tearing his study apart, seeing the mocking faces of his enemies in every shadow. But beneath his rage was a cold, gnawing fear. This was not the work of a simple drifter. The attack was too precise, too strategic. This Jasper, this Jax, was something more, something dangerous. And the girl, Laura, was no longer just a victim. She was a symbol, a banner for a rebellion he could not allow to take root. He doubled the patrols, hired more gunslingers from out of town, and offered a staggering bounty for Jax, dead or alive, and for the return of Alara. He was trying to reassert his power through money and brute force, but his actions had the opposite effect. His paranoia, his increasingly erratic and violent temper, made his own men nervous. The other, smaller ranchers in the valley, who had long chafed under Croft's thumb, saw his weakness and began to quietly fortify their own homesteads. The embers of rebellion were being stirred. Meanwhile, in the vast, hidden wilderness of the Badlands, Jax and Alara were becoming a ruthlessly efficient two-person army. They did not rest. They used their newfound supplies and weapons to escalate their campaign. They were ghosts, striking and fading away before Croft's men could even react. One night, they crept to the edge of Croft's main grazing pasture and, with a series of loud gunshots and terrifying yells, spooked his prize herd of 1,000 cattle. The resulting stampede tore down miles of fences and scattered the herd across 50 square miles of hostile territory. It would take Croft's men weeks to round them all up, a devastating blow to his profits and his pride. A few nights later, they set fire to 3 of his outlying line shacks, small cabins used by his ranch hands during roundups. The fires were a signal, visible for miles in the clear desert night, a beacon of defiance that told the whole valley that the ghosts were still out there, and touchable. During this time, Alara's transformation was complete. The fear that had once paralyzed her was burned away in the crucible of their campaign, replaced by a cold, hard courage. She learned to read the land, to move with a hunter's stealth, to think tactically. She was no longer just following Jax, she was his partner. Her knowledge of the area allowed them to anticipate Croft's movements, and her fierce, righteous anger fueled their fight. The bond between them deepened, forged in the shared danger and the quiet moments of peace in their hidden canyon. They were two broken people who, together, were becoming whole. He had given her the strength to fight, and she had given him a cause to fight for, a cause that was about more than just the ghosts of his own past. It was about building a future. Their campaign of harassment culminated in their most audacious plan yet. Alara knew that Croft's power was rooted in his control of the water. While he had wells on his main ranch, his most valuable asset was a series of windmills and stock tanks that pumped the last of the valley's groundwater to his herds in the outer pastures. Without that water, his dominion would wither and die. "We can't destroy the windmills," Allura said, as they planned their next move. "That would hurt the land and the other ranchers who sometimes use that water. But we can stop them." Using tools taken from one of the burn-lined shacks, they embarked on a daring, week-long campaign of sabotage. Under the cover of darkness, they would ride to each windmill, and Jax, using his knowledge of mechanics, would disable the pumping mechanism, removing a single, vital piece from each one. They did not break them, they simply rendered them useless. The effect was catastrophic for Croft. His cattle began to suffer from thirst. His men were run ragged trying to haul water in wagons to the desperate herds. His empire was beginning to crumble from the inside out. He was losing control. And a man like Silas Croft, when he loses control, becomes a cornered, wounded animal. He becomes desperate. And a desperate man is the most dangerous kind of all. Croft knew he could not win this war of shadows. He could not fight ghosts. He had to change the battlefield. He had to draw them out into the open. And he knew exactly what bait to use. He sent a single rider out under a flag of truce, a young ranch hand that Allura knew and trusted. The boy found their canyon not by tracking, but because Jax allowed him to. The boy carried a message from Silas Croft. It was not a threat. It was a proposal. He says he's beaten, the boy told them, his eyes wide with fear and awe. He wants to parley. He'll sign over the deed to your farm, Allura, cancel all the debts, and give you safe passage out of the valley. In return, you and the ghost just have to ride away and never come back. Jax and Allura listened, their expressions grim. They both knew it was a lie. The meeting, Jax asked, his voice low. "Where?" "At the Agua Fria Spring," the boy replied, naming the source of the conflict, the headwaters on Allura's own land. "Sunrise, in 2 days. He says he'll come alone." "He's lying," Allura said immediately, after the boy had gone. "It's a trap. He'll have men hidden everywhere." "I know," Jax said, his pale eyes fixed on the horizon. "He knows we'll know it's a trap. But he also knows we have to go. This is his last, desperate gamble. He's forcing a final confrontation, on ground of his choosing." They were at a crossroads. They could refuse, continue their ghost war, and perhaps, eventually, win a war of attrition. Or they could face the beast in his den, risk everything on one final, decisive battle, and win their freedom once and for all. Allura looked at Jax, and she saw the answer in his eyes. He was a man who did not believe in long, drawn-out wars. He believed in endings. "We go," she said, her voice not a question, but a statement of their shared will. "But we don't go to his trap. We go to our own." The 2 days leading up to the rendezvous were a whirlwind of quiet, intense preparation. They were not preparing to walk into a parley. They were preparing to spring a counter-trap. The final battlefield would be Allura's home, the Rocking V Ranch, and they would use her intimate knowledge of every ditch, every rock, and every creak of a floorboard to their advantage. They left the Badlands for the last time, riding through the night to arrive at the deserted farmhouse a full day before the meeting. The place was thick with memories for Allura. It was the house she had grown up in, the porch her father had built with his own hands. Seeing it now, dusty and silent, filled her with a fierce, protective resolve. This was more than just a fight for her life. It was a fight for her soul, for her past and her future. They didn't stay in the house. Instead, they worked, turning the entire farmstead into a defensive labyrinth. They chose their positions not in the obvious places, but in the unexpected ones. Jax in the hayloft of the barn, which offered a commanding, elevated view of the spring, and Allura inside the small, stone-walled springhouse, a nearly impregnable position with a narrow view of the meeting ground. They set up distractions, small piles of brush that could be set alight to create confusion, and identified escape routes. As the first, faint hint of gray appeared on the eastern horizon on the day of the meeting, they were in position. The air was cool and still, filled with the scent of damp earth and the nervous energy of the coming confrontation. Allura, her rifle resting on the cool stone ledge of the springhouse window, felt a strange sense of calm. The fear was gone, replaced by an absolute, unwavering focus. She was no longer a victim. She was a soldier, defending her home. As the sun began to rise, casting long, dramatic shadows across the land, they appeared. As expected, Croft was not alone. He rode towards the spring with four of his most hardened gunslingers, moving with a confident swagger. They stopped, and Croft dismounted, striding towards the spring alone, a white flag held loosely in his hand, a mockery of the peace he was pretending to offer. His men, meanwhile, fanned out, taking cover in the rocks and trees surrounding the clearing. It was a clumsy, obvious trap. Croft stood by the water's edge, the rising sun glinting off the silver on his gun belt. "Allura, Jasper," he called out, his voice echoing in the quiet morning. "I am here, as promised. Come out and let us end this." The silence was his only answer. He waited, his arrogance slowly turning to irritation. "Do not play games with me. Show yourselves." From his position in the hayloft, Jax took a deep breath. It was time. He fired his rifle, not at Croft, but at a small pile of dry tumbleweeds near where one of the hidden gunmen was crouched. The tumbleweeds ignited instantly, the sudden plume of smoke and flame causing the gunman to cry out in surprise and expose his position. At the same instant, from the spring house, Allura fired. Her shot was true. It struck the rock just above the gunman's head, sending him scrambling for better cover. The fight had begun, on their terms. The clearing erupted into a chaotic gunfight. Croft's men, their ambush spoiled, began firing wildly at the barn and the spring house. But they were firing at fortified, unexpected positions. Jax and Allura, in contrast, knew exactly where their enemies were. From the hayloft, Jax was a specter of death. He fired with a methodical and hurried rhythm, his shots precise and devastating. He pinned down two of the gunmen, forcing them to stay behind their cover, unable to move or get a clear shot. Allura, from her stone fortress, focused on the other two. She was not as skilled as Jax, but her position was superior. She laid down a steady, suppressing fire, her bullets chipping away at the rocks her enemies were hiding behind, making it impossible for them to advance or support their comrades. Croft, caught in the crossfire, roared in rage and frustration. His perfect trap had been turned against him. He was exposed, his men were pinned down, and he was losing. He fired his pistol at the barn, then at the spring house, his shots wild and ineffective. The battle was short and brutal. One of the gunmen, trying to change position, was caught in the open by one of Jax's carefully aimed shots. He went down and didn't move again. Another, panicked by the relentless fire from Allura's position, broke cover and tried to run. Jax's rifle cracked once more, and the man fell. Seeing two of his men down and the other two hopelessly pinned, Croft finally broke. His arrogance and bravado were stripped away, revealing the coward beneath. With a curse, he turned and ran for his horse. "He's getting away," Allura shouted, shifting her aim towards the fleeing land baron. "Let him go," Jax's voice called from the barn, calm and authoritative. "He's not the prize." Just as Croft reached his horse, his last two gunmen, seeing their leader abandon them, threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. It was over. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of the burning tumbleweeds and the sound of Croft's hoofbeats fading into the distance. Jax and Allura emerged from their positions, their rifles held ready. They disarmed the two surrendered gunmen and sent them walking back to the Croft Dominion with a final message. "Tell your boss this valley is no longer his. Tell him the law is coming for him. And if he ever shows his face here again, the ghosts of the Rocking V will be waiting." As the sun climbed higher, bathing the small farm in a warm, golden light, they stood together by the clear, bubbling water of the Ogofria spring. They had won. The land was free. Allura was free. They looked at each other, the smoke and tension of the battle still clinging to them. The long, bloody nightmare was over. But a new, unwritten chapter was just beginning. "What now?" Allura asked, her voice quiet. Will you ride on?" Jax looked at the small, sturdy farmhouse, at the clear water, at the woman of incredible strength and courage standing before him. He thought of his lonely past, the endless trail of dust and ghosts. He realized, with a sense of profound, quiet certainty, that he had finally found a place where he didn't need to run anymore. "No," he said, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his weathered face. "I think I think I've finally found a ghost worth staying for." He reached out and took her hand. Their fingers interlaced, a silent promise of a shared future. Silas Croft had been driven off, his power broken. The valley would heal. There would be challenges ahead, and new life to build from the ashes of the old one. But they would face it together. They turned and walked towards the farmhouse, their home, hand in hand. They were two survivors, a cowboy and a farmer's daughter, who had found in each other not just a savior, but a partner. As they stepped onto the porch her father had built, the sun rose fully over the horizon, its bright, hopeful rays heralding a new day and a new beginning. Their future was as vast and full of promise as the prairie stretching out before them.